to go look for those breach credentials, or I'm going to look for that juicy information on Google or social media or where I can find it, and utilize that time while this is scanning, or else I'll just be sitting on my hands doing nothing while these wait. So we're going to take this information now and we're going to start reviewing it. So we have here our scan results, and you can see the scan results come back, and the first thing we notice are open ports. That's what we want to look at. We want to look at these open ports, and we want to look at what's running on these open ports. So we see here that what's running on port 22 is SSH. Okay, on top of that, it's got a version here for us. So OpenSSH 2.9 P2. And then we see Apache is running on port 80. We've also got Apache running on port 443. And we've got this RPC bind in 139. Now remember from the networking lesson, these kind of always play together. So we've got SMB open, basically Samba shares. And what we can do is, first step is usually enumeration. Once we see this, we take the scan in, we scroll down a little bit as well, and we can look at some things and see, okay, there's no OS information. It found Linux here, 2.4.x, and it's most likely pulling that down from the Apache. It's probably a best guess because it's running Red Hat, that it's running Linux, and taking a stab at it here, or may have actually determined that from sort of header or some other location. A lot of times, this isn't so sure as it's saying it is here. A lot of times it'll give you a percentage. So the OS is not always definitive as it is here. So we've got the OS, which could be useful for us later when we do enumeration, and you'll see how that comes into play. What I want you to take in right now is that so far we've got a scan result back, and that scan has gone out and it has looked for open ports doing that modified stealth handshake. So it says SYN reset RST. Doing that, it's found a few open ports. Now it is our job to look up the information that we are seeing on these open ports and try to find exploits on them. So that's what we're going to do. And I'm going to cover in the next video, we're going to go kind of step by step, and I'll talk through the methodology and why I attack certain ports first, what ports those are, how we can enumerate those ports, and then we'll enumerate everything, get all the details down. Once we have all the details down, we're going to move into the section of exploitation. It's going to get really fun, and we'll exploit this machine in multiple ways. So from here, just take apart or take that away from the lesson that you've officially successfully scanned this machine. I encourage you to maybe go back and take notes, or to go back and scan it again. Get the syntax down in your head. Keep typing this out. Remember it. This is the one thing you're probably going to type out more than anything else. And then also go through and look at the different types of options you have there. If there's one that interests you, just run it against the machine. Play around with it. This is your lab time. Make the most of it. So for now, that's it. In the next video, we're going to start enumerating these ports. So I will catch you over in the next video. Let's talk about the scan before we dive into any enumeration. So the scan here, we've got these open ports. We've got 22 with SSH, and we've got 80 and 443, which are hosting websites. And then we've got 139, which has got a file share with Samba on it. And then you've got the 111 and 32.768, which are RPC and related to the SMB. So we need to think about point of attack as an attacker. Now, when I see this scan, I light up with 80 and 443, and I light up with 139, and sometimes you'll see 445 with it as well. I light up from those because those are commonly found with exploits. If we think back about all of the exploits that have been out there for a website, for example, or if we think to Samba or SMB related exploits, just recently, right now it's recording in 2019. In 2017, there was malware that went around called WannaCry, and that was based off of something called Eternal Blue, also known as MS17010. It was a pretty wicked exploit that utilized a flaw in SMB. SMB has been historically bad, and websites have been historically bad. Now, when we see something like port 22, port 22 is SSH, and historically, it hasn't really been that bad. Now, we can try attacks against it like brute force attacks, or we can try something like default credentials or root Tor on it, for example. But when we look at it, we can maybe enumerate the version, but there's not usually what we call remote code execution on SSH. Remote code execution being that we can run an exploit against it and get something called a shell back. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the exploitation section. But for now, just know that it's not really common to attack SSH. So when I see SSH open, we can do some things at it, but when we talk about low-hanging fruit, and that's really what we're after as an attacker, we're going to see what's juiciest first and kind of go from there. So you'll develop your own methodology over time, but I'm going to drill into your head, at least my methodology, why I do things, and there will be several videos of walkthrough machines in this course. So you're going to get to see this over and over and over, and I'm just going to explain my methodology repeatedly so that you can get introduced to new tools and new ideas and ways of thinking. So from here, I do want to dive into my first thought process, which is I want to investigate port 80 and 443. I would either here, I would do 8443 or I'd go right after 139. So we'll do 8443 and start working towards those. Now let's go ahead and just do the first step. This is always my first step. If I see a website, I'm just going to go out to the website. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this here. And I'm also going to go into the little hamburger and go to my preferences. And I have not turned off my Burp Suite settings, and it's possible that if you're just following along, you haven't turned it off either. So go ahead and just select Use System Proxy Settings, and we'll just say OK. And now we should be able to navigate to our website. I'll just open up a new tab just in case. We'll do something like this. Good, that worked. And then we'll do the HTTPS version because there's also 443. You might get something saying your connection's not secure. Just go ahead and say advanced and add an exception here. Confirm it, and you'll see this. Okay, so what we have here on both of these is we have a default web page. Now, when we talk about performing a network penetration test or even a web application penetration test, if we see a default web page like this, this is an automatic finding. Now, why is this a finding? Is it exploitable? No, not really, but it tells us a little bit of something about the architecture that's running behind the scenes, and it tells us a little bit about the client's potential hygiene. So if we see this, well, we know that it's running Apache. We know that potentially the box is running Red Hat Linux, and we're just getting ideas of what's going on behind the scenes. More so, if a client is running a default web page, it brings up two questions. One, are there other web directories behind this? So we'll show you something here in a second where we do directory busting and attempt to find a directory. Like say we're looking at this and we don't have anything to click on, but we say, /admin, maybe that directory's there. Okay, are they hosting a website somewhere else that's just not at this IP address on this base? Or maybe they aren't hosting any website and they just left 443 and 80 open for no reason and put this default web page out there. Now, when you think about that, that signals to an attacker poor hygiene. And I'm going to think to myself as an attacker, if a company or a client is willing to just put this out there willy-nilly, what else are they doing? What potential vulnerabilities might they have if they're doing this? So this immediately signals poor hygiene. We would write this up on a test, and I'm going to show you guys my notes once we kind of get towards the end of the enumeration. So make sure you're taking good notes, and we can do that in like a little notepad here and kind of what we're doing. I think this is useful, and then I'll make a nice little keep note, or you can make a cherry tree and make your own notes out of this, and I'll show you what it looks like towards the end of the enumeration. But we can say something like 8443, and then you can put the IP address, and sometimes people like to put notes at like what time they did this. So you could see up here it's 22:58 or 10:58 p.m. my time. And we could take that and we can just say default web page. and we can say Apache, and we could tell that it's running potentially PHP, and we'll get behind this as well. And we just have these little notes. So we know that we navigated to it, right? At least this is part of the enumeration here. And you don't have to timestamp everything. I'm just giving you that for an example, but we can see that it's running this default web page. So we have a default web page. There's nothing really for us to click on. I mean, we've got like the documentation. We can go to like, it looks like the manual might be here. And this here, we just clicked on a link and it was a bad link. Now this is also what's called information disclosure. So this would be another one to bring up. But we see here that we have an error page. And this error page is saying, hey, it's not found. Now this is typical of what's called a 404. And when you see a 404, you think, okay, it usually redirects you to a page that's like, hey, we can't find this. This is giving us a little bit more information than we should be getting. We're seeing here that we're getting Apache version 1.3.20. So now, if we didn't know already, we do know that we're running Apache 1.3.20. And we got a host name here, Kioptrix.level1. That is a internal information host name, right? So we can get naming convention out of a client. We could potentially know how they are utilizing naming conventions on their internal networks. And we've got some version enumeration or information disclosure. So this would be a screenshot as well that we would take a picture of. And you can also notate that in your notes and say something like, you'd say information disclosure and then you could say something like 404 page, and then you would just have your notes or a screenshot of this. And then that would indicate to you what you can write up on the report and kind of where you found it. So we can click around on this page, or we can do a little bit of what I like to do, which is vulnerability scanning. So I'm going to introduce you to another tool, which is called Nikto. So let's open up a new tab. We can close these two tabs out if you've got extra tabs like I do. And this tool is called Nikto. It's just like this. So Nikto is what is known as a web vulnerability scanner. This is a great tool when you're learning the beginning stuff, when you're practicing against VulnHub, or you're practicing on a CTF or something like a Hack the Box, which I haven't introduced to you yet. But it will help you do vulnerability scanning against a website. The issue is that if the website is running good security, you might run into some issues with that, and it might actually auto block it if it detects Nikto scans. Not always. Very commonly, that's not the case. But if they've got good security or a good web application firewall, it might actually block these scans. So you have to kind of be wary when you use it, and really use your hunch if you think that this client is using a web application firewall or not. And you'll really get a feel for the client just as you gain more practice. And once you're getting in there and you're starting to notice vulnerabilities or not, you'll kind of understand whether or not they're running something like that. So from here, we're just going to say Nikto, and you can always do a -- help, but it's pretty straightforward. All we're going to do is say a -h for host. And then we're just going to say something like HTTPS, and then we'll just paste our address, something like this. And that one did not work. So let's go ahead and try HTTP and see. There we go. For some reason, it's not picking up the SSL on this. So I'm not sure why it's not discovering. But now we can see our scans kicking back. And immediately we can see that it's doing some detections here. It's detecting that the server Apache 1.3.20 is running. It sees this mod SSL with OpenSSL. It's giving us some vulnerabilities back. It's telling us what is missing in terms of protections. Now, these protection headers, if we're doing an external penetration test, not really that important. If we're doing a web app penetration test, these become more important, but we don't have to worry about them right now. So when we come through, we keep looking and we see Apache 1.3.20 appears to be outdated. Okay, mod SSL appears to be outdated. OpenSSL appears to be outdated. These are all findings. depending on how outdated it is, a 1.3.20 to a 2.4.37 is pretty outdated. So these would be findings that we would notate on a report as well. We can look through and you can see what types of attacks this might be vulnerable to. So one, if you're looking through, there's this Apache here that says remote denial of service. Well, typically denial of service is out of scope when we're doing a pen test, so we're not interested in that. Possible code execution, so maybe interested in that. We are also potentially interested in a overflow and rewrite, and this one says this is vulnerable to a remote buffer overflow, remote being important, which may allow a remote shell. So remote meaning we do not have to be local. So I skipped over this one where you see local. This one is remote, meaning we can run that against a site sitting in our pajamas in our house, and that site's running somewhere else, and we can do this all remotely. So immediately it's found potential vulnerabilities. So we've got this potential mod SSL vulnerability, and it's come down here and it's looking at some other things. You could see that this trace method is active, and we still haven't gotten into web apps, so really don't need to talk about it too much. But trace is potentially vulnerable when you have something like cross-site scripting, which you see up here, and that could lead to something called cross-site tracing, but you kind of need both of those. But again, that's just informational at this point. You don't have to really be taking notes on that. So we're coming through. It does a little bit of directory busting for us. So what that means is it's just going to come through here and it's going to run like a word list. And that word list might have like admin, usage, manual, right? Test.php. It's got all these different items that it found doing this word list. Now we're going to do a little bit of directory busting here in a second. So we'll save this scan and we'll keep this in our notes. And we'll refer back to it here in a little bit. But what we need to know is we can Alt-Tab and we can get our text editor and we could say something about, let's just copy and paste this line here, that potentially this mod SSL is vulnerable. So let's copy that. And we'll put that into our text editor and we'll make that as a note. So we're still doing enumeration. We're not gonna do any exploitation until we get to the exploitation stage. So what we would do typically is we'll save this out to a file. So you might want to like copy this, all this right here to show what you ran. And if I could copy, that would be really useful. So you copy this and you would just make maybe a directory and you could call this something like Chioptrix. And then we could cd into Chioptrix and then you could say gedit nicto.txt. And then you have your Nicto scan saved. So this is part of being a good pen tester, is saving all of your scans and having them available in case you need to go back for notes. So we'll save that. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna pause here. We're gonna call this part 1, and then we'll go into part 2 and talk a little bit more about directory busting and look at some other enumeration features that we have for this. And then we'll start focusing on other ports and really enumerate this box thoroughly before we work on exploitation. So I will catch you over in part 2 of this video, and I'll see you when you get over there. So now we're going to use a tool called dirbuster to do a little bit of directory busting. There are other tools out there that are similar or do the same thing. There are 2 built-in tools, in fact. There's dirbuster, and there's also a tool called dirb, and then there is a tool called gobuster. And you have a lot of options. My option of choice is dirbuster, but I do recommend that you write these down and just explore them for yourself and see which one you like the best. So I'm going to go ahead and run dirbuster, and I'm going to run it like this with the ampersand at the end. And it's going to load up this nice little interface. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, I want to run against this target URL. I'm going to go ahead and just copy this right here. And Alt-Tab back into it. And syntax is important. It's going to want the port 80 at the end. You see the port 80 here with the slash. And we're going to say, go ahead and go faster on these threads. And then we're going to go ahead and pick a list. So go ahead and go to Browse. And let's go ahead and go to your base folder here. Go into your user, your USR folder, your share, which is right here. And then if you start typing word lists, it'll bring up word lists right here. And then you see Dirbuster has its own folder right here. So we're going to select Dirbuster. And from here, we can pick a variety of different lists. I like to just use the small list. If I'm not finding anything at all, maybe I'll move up to the medium, and out on the interweb is a large list as well. Well, let's just go ahead and start with small for proof of concept. And so now let's break it down. We've kind of talked about it in the last video, but let's just do a quick reminder. What we're doing is we're going out to web directories and we're using these word lists. And these word lists have hundreds, if not thousands, of different well-known directories. So it could be something like admin or like CGI bin, etc. And it's going to go out and try to navigate to these. It's also going to look for specific file extensions. So we know that we're up against an Apache website. Well, Apache runs PHP. If we were up against something like a Microsoft website, which is IIS, well, those tend to run something called ASP or ASPX. And so this is why enumeration is important as well, because we need to know what's running on the back end to find or make the most use out of it. Now, what we can do with these file extensions, and what I like to do, is I like to run it against PHP or whatever the base of the server is. But I also do like to run something like a text file, something like a zip file, and you can make this as long as, or yeah, as many as you want. You could say RAR, PDF, docx, but the more of these that you put in there, the more times it's going to search, because it's going to search through the word list and say the word list has admin in it. It's going to try admin.pdf or admin.zip. So it's important to limit these to what you need. For our sake, I'm just going to go ahead and just use PHP, and we're going to just scan with the default results here and just kind of see what happens. So we'll go ahead and start that, and this will kick off and start scanning, and it's already finding right away. It's finding some stuff. You can see the list getting big, and you can go to this results view where you can see what it's found. And you can also go to this tree view here and see what it's found. You can kind of click in. You can see it's found some potentially interesting files. We can go enumerate these as well. And it's found test.php page. You can right click on these and open in browser. And you can see that it's found this print test here in PHP 4. So we can look through some of these pages. We're going to go ahead and just let that go for now. It's going to take a minute. It could take up to a while to scan, depending on how big your word list is, how many options you choose, and how well your website is cooperating with your scan as well. So from here, I'm going to show you a few more things. So let's go back to our preferences. If you still have that open, go ahead and go back. And let's go ahead and just go to the settings. And we'll go to our manual configuration, and let's boot up Burp Suite. And this is just another proof of concept that Burp Suite is your friend, especially when you're looking at websites. So we're going to utilize it just to take a peek. I just want to see what's out there. So we'll go ahead and just hit next and start Burp Suite here on this. And while we wait, another thing that I need to point out is if this were a website, like a real website, instead of a test page, and a very important thing to do is view the source code. So we can right click in here and we could say view page source, and we can view the source code. Now what we're looking for in source code are any kind of comments, potentially any kind of information disclosures. We might be looking for any sort of keys or password or user accounts or anything that might be disclosed in a source code that should not be disclosed. A lot of times when you do CTFs or you do Hack the Box or Vulnhubs, they hide little comments in source code. But in a pen tester point of view, we're looking for more important things like the passwords or keys, etc. So we've got Burp Suite open, and we're just going to go ahead and intercept one request here. And we're going to go ahead and just let this forward. Actually, we'll send this to repeater. I'm going to show you a little trick. Go ahead and send this to repeater. So you right click, send a repeater, and you'll see your repeater tab opens up here. Now the neat thing about repeater is that repeater will show you your response in real time, and you can modify these. So you could say, hey, I want to send this here, or you could say something about, like, I want to send a post request maybe, and let that run. And you could see, well, it says, okay, method not allowed. So it doesn't like that. But you can send different results, modify what you see here, and see how that works for us. Now, this is not taking this exactly, so let's forward and see maybe if we're missing anything, and we're not. So another thing that we can do is we can actually copy this, and what we can do is we go into the target here, and we've got the target showing. We could set the scope if we need to. So we can go to scope here, and we can just say add, and then paste this in here for HTTP, and we could do HTTPS for both. But let's just do HTTP, and we'll just say yes. And what this does for us is this limits only searching for in-scope items. So we're going to just limit now, and then we're going to go ahead and look at the response that came back, and you see there's no response here, but there is a 304 not modified. And the interesting thing is, look at the server header. The server header is disclosing information to us as well, and we saw this in the NICTO scan. It's all coming back around, right? We saw the NICTO scan say Apache 1.3.20, and it pulled down this server header. This is why it's so useful. And this in itself, a screenshot of this right here, is information disclosure as well. So this client that we're working on has a little bit of information disclosure problems, and we can just say information disclosure here, and we'll do something, if I can type disclosure here, and we'll say something like server headers disclose version information. And we'll take a screenshot of that, and we'll put that in our notes as well. So we're going to get really deep into Burp Suite once we get to the web app section. I just like to get you utilizing it and familiar with it, and just so you're comfortable by the time we get there. We're going to use it a few more times when we talk through network items, and then once we get to the web app, it's going to be a lot of Burp Suite. So we'll get very comfortable with it very quick. So let's take another peek at our Dirbuster and see how that's working. And you could see that it still has 23 minutes, but I really just want to put you through the concept of it. The concept of it here is that we are looking for any sort of interesting directories, and you can see response codes here as well. If you've never seen a response code, just know for now that 200s mean okay, 400s mean there's some sort of error, most typically like a 404 means page not found, and a 300 is typically a redirect, and then there's 500 which are like server errors or other. So what we're going to come in here and do is just kind of peek at these, and we can just kind of open these and see. Icons probably not that interesting. Doc has nothing in it right now. The manual is not going to be that interesting to us. Neither is usage. Maybe usage is interesting. Let's open one of these in the browser, and we can see what's kind of running. And if you have your proxy on, go ahead and turn your intercept off. You see mine caught there. Okay, and now this is an interesting page here. We can see usage statistics, and this might give us a little bit of information disclosure if we're able to access it. At least here, well, we can see a couple things. We see Webalizer version 2.01, so we can copy this and see if there's anything about this here on this machine that maybe is exploitable. So let's add this here as Webalizer version 201, and we'll just put it like on this usage.html. Now, we don't know for sure if this is running out on the web or if this is just an HTML page that has been generated by something else. So not for certain that it's actually running on this. It could just be something that they have in this usage folder, but it's always good to notate what kind of items they might be using, and they're utilizing this Webalizer for sure, at least in their network. Again, this is probably a little bit of information disclosure or information leakage here. So they've got a consistent problem with that. So let's go ahead and look more at the results, and MRTG is in here, and we can come through here and just look like, what's MRTG? And we can open that in the browser. It says, what is MRTG? It says multi-router traffic grapher. Okay. And we could scroll through this, read the details, and we can keep going through here. And this could very well be a rabbit hole, but this kind of makes sense. And there's a web server here. There's a log file. Let's view the log file. Nothing unique there. Let's view the web server. Let's see if it's the same page. And it's a little bit different, but not entirely different. So it's possible what we're seeing here is that what we talked about in the part 1 of this video, which is that we're seeing the test page is out there. And why was it out there, right? Is it poor hygiene? It's still poor hygiene, even if they're running a web server, but they are running a web server here on the back end. Whether this web server is useful to us or not, really don't know. So the goal through this is to dig, and this is my challenge for you, is to dig kind of through these results that you get back. So wait until your scans finish here and dig through the results. Look at all of these. To me, right now, it doesn't look that interesting, but again, we haven't fully enumerated. The real enumeration would be to go through each and every one of these and determine if there's anything of value here. Is there any sort of service information that could be useful, etc. So where we're at on the web ports at the moment, again, as a recap, we have our scan back, right? And we've seen 80's open and running Apache 1.3.20. We see 443's got the same. We also know about the mod SSL 2.8.4 and OpenSSL 0.9.6b. Doesn't hurt to copy this and put this in our notes too, because I think that's pretty useful. We've got that here. Let's just go ahead and maybe put something up above just as a note. And we ran our Nikto scan and we saved this for our notes. So when we go write our report, we have it ready. And we've got some information here that we've written down as well. So it appears that there are some potential vulnerabilities here, but we won't know until we start digging into Google, okay? And that will be very, very important, but we're gonna get to that when we start getting into the end of this little series here, and then we get in transition into the exploitation part of the series. We'll work on exploiting these. So this is just a few tricks on how you can enumerate websites. And when we're coming through and showing you these ports, and we go over all these ports that we see, we're going to come across new ports when we do pen tests. And what it comes down to is just having a methodology. You might discover a new port, and as long as you have a methodology, that's all you need. So we're going to work on building that methodology, and you might find other tools for searching websites that you like. You might say, hey, I hate your methods, or, these tools just work better for me. And that's absolutely fine as long as you're developing your own methodology. So just start thinking about when you see a website, what are the basics that you're looking for? When you come across the website, you're looking for service version information, which we have here. You're looking for any sort of maybe backend directories. You're looking for source code. You're looking for potential vulnerability scanning with Nikto, and any sort of information that you can divulge. Same thing, we can come back here. We talked about it before with Wappalyzer. You can click on Wappalyzer and see a lot of the same things that we saw. It knows the operating system, it knows the web server extensions, and it knows what's running on the back end. So there's a lot of useful information here, and this is all we are after at this point. We just want to scan and enumerate, and then we're going to dig deep and exploit. So that is it for this. We're going to move on to the next port in this section. We'll do a little bit more enumeration, see what else we can uncover. So I will catch you over in the next video. Now that we've taken some time to enumerate web pages on port 80 and 443, we're going to go ahead and shift our focus over to SMB on port 139. So if you are unfamiliar with what SMB is a file share. So think about your work environment. If you go to work and let's say that you have a drive you access, that's not like your common drive, like a C drive. Maybe it's like a Z drive or a G drive, and you access that drive to get files, and you can upload the files, download the files, and then maybe some of your coworkers can also see that file share. And that's why it's called a file share. Another example is, say you have a scans folder and you go to your printer and you scan something and magically it appears in your scans folder on your computer. That's another example of SMB. So SMB is commonly used in work environments and internal environments. So when we see it, we think internal, and we think about all these exploits that I have mentioned in the past, with especially with latest and greatest being MS17010. And even though it's 2 years old, it still shows up, and it's going to show up again in this course later on. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take a quick look at our scan and see what we have available to us. So on port 139 here, we see that, okay, NetBIOS, SMB, workgroup, my group, not really a lot of information. We could scroll down, and the great thing about the -A that I had you run with this scan is that it does run scripts for us. So these scripts that we're running go out and do a little bit of enumeration or additional enumeration. And here it came through and it's pulling down some information. We could see that, okay, the NetBIOS name of this is called Captrix. Well, we kind of already knew that. And we can see here that it's running SMB version 2. We really don't know that for sure, or what SMB version it's running exactly. So that's really important, because the type of SMB version that's running could potentially lead to an exploit, and we need to know that kind of information. So we're going to look for version information. The other thing is we're going to try to connect to this machine. We're going to see if there's any connections available to us. And if we can make that connection, if we can get to the files on the share and see if there's anything potentially malicious, or that we could do potentially malicious. So let's go ahead and let's get into a terminal. And we're going to load up a tool that you're going to be intimately familiar with by the time this course is over. And that tool is called Metasploit. So to run that tool, just go ahead and type in MSF console like this and hit enter. Now, Metasploit is a exploitation framework, and it does a lot more than exploitation. As you can see down here, you can see that it does exploits, what are called auxiliary modules. Now, auxiliary modules is like scanning and enumeration. So we can actually do port scanning. We can do all kinds of information gathering with these auxiliary modules. They're awesome. We're going to go through one right now. There's also these post modules, which do post exploitation. So say we get a shell on a machine, which means we've exploited a machine. We can do some things in post. There's all different types of payloads, which we're going to cover when we get into the exploit section. And then the rest of this, you don't have to worry about that for the scope of this course, but we will be seeing another tool by Metasploit, which is MSF Venom, later in the exploit development section of the course, because we're going to utilize that to build payloads out for our own shells. So what we're going to do for now is we're just going to introduce this slowly. Don't feel overwhelmed. It's just a little bit of a learning curve when it comes to learning all the features that it has available, but it's second nature once you learn it, and it's going to be one of the most commonly used tools that you use as a tester in the field. So we're going to go ahead and just search for SMB here, and I'm going to do this the terrible way. We're just going to search SMB, and you can see that there's 121 results. Now that's going to be quite a pain to sift through. But what we're after, and say we didn't know much, but we're trying to see if, hey, maybe does Metasploit have any kind of modules, I don't know, for SMB enumeration? Well, we know auxiliary modules are enumeration. And we can look right here in the front and see what type of module it is. So you see this is a post module, and you see we could scroll up and we're going through exploits, and then we're going to go up into auxiliary. Now, the second part of this is the type of action it's doing. So you can see auxiliary denial of service, auxiliary fuzzing, auxiliary scanning, gathering, and we're going to utilize this to our advantage. So we're going to take a look at the syntax. Now, what we are after is SMB version information. And if we look kind of through this, we can come down to scanner here, and you can see it's looking SMB1, 2, GPP, which we're going to talk about, MS17010, which we've talked about. You have an auxiliary scanner to see if there's anything out there with that vulnerability. And if we look right here on number 60, auxiliary scanner SMB version. Now, this is a bit of a long, convoluted way to do this. Go ahead and copy this, by the way, or memorize your number. I'll give you two options. This is a long way to do it, but I wanted to show you this way of doing it because you're going to get better at it. But when you see something on a scan result and you don't know a lot about the tool, the best thing that you can do is just say, hey, I know Metasploit does things like this. Let me see if maybe they have any sort of enumeration or exploitation. It never hurts to use a search feature to try to look up items and learn about them. So let's say we've never used this before. We're going to go ahead and just say use, and then we're going to paste this module in here. Your other option is instead of pasting this module, you can put the number that you had. So like, for example, 60, you could say use 60, and it will also load this module. So go ahead and hit enter for that. And you can see here that it says now we're in an auxiliary module of scanner SMB underscore version. So from here, it's always good to type out info and see what info is available. And it just tells you a little bit about the module that you're running. So here you see that this is going to display version information about each system. Perfect. It's an SMB version detection. That's really what we're after right now. So this is great. And we have options here, these basic options. Now you're going to see me do this a lot. You can go right into options by just typing options and just see that instead of printing out all the long stuff if you don't want to. So in our options, we're presented with some items. We've got something called rhost. Now rhost is what stands for remote host. You're also going to see an lhost later on, which stands for local host. Rhost is always the victim. That's who we are attacking. This is the target address. You might see rhost or rhost plural. Rhost means you can only import one host. If we have rhost plural, we can use CIDR notation, meaning that we could put /24 and try to sweep a range, for example. But in this instance, we're only attacking one machine anyway. The rest of these, SMB domain, password, and user, if we knew the domain, password, and user in this instance, we could fill it out and try to get a little bit more information. But we are unauthenticated. We have no credentials at this point, so we're just going to go ahead and just put in rhost, which is required, and not fill out any of the non-required fields here. And what we're going to do is we're just going to say set rhost, and this isn't case sensitive. I just like to type it out case sensitive. And then the IP address of the machine that you're going to scan. So we're going to say 192.168 minus 57.139. And then I'm just going to type in run, give you a second to catch up, and run. Okay, I totally lied. My IP address is 139. The machine I'm after is 134. And run. Your screen should have looked something like this. I'm over here, instead of copying, pasting, trying to memorize. So hopefully you can see that I make mistakes too. So here we are, we see a little bit more information, and it might not look like a lot right now, but knowing this Samba 2.2.1a is very specific, and this is going to help us out quite a bit. So let's just copy this guy, and let's open up that text editor we've had going, and let's just come in here and maybe make some notes, or just put it in here and say something like SMB, and then we can just paste that. We know the version now. And this is going to become important when we start doing research on what we've found. So we found all these different type of versions running up here, and we're going to do research on exploitations against them. But we're also going to do research on this and exploitations against this. So as much detail as we can get, that's what's important. And what's going to set you apart from other hackers or other people even trying to break into the field is your ability to information gather and your ability to enumerate. If you can do both of those, the exploitation is actually the easy part, in my opinion. So we've got the version information. That's great. We're going to use a new tool now. So go ahead and go File, New Tab. And I'm going to go ahead and show you a tool called SMB Client. Now, SMB Client is going to attempt to connect to the file share that's out there. Now, if we have the ability to connect to the file share with anonymous access, what that'll do is we can get in there and we could potentially see files. Now, these files might give us an inkling of what's going on in the network, or they may even be, valuable to us. They might be something like a backup file or password stored in a text file. You never know what you're going to find until you actually look. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is do a -L, and that's going to be to list out the files. And then the syntax looks something like this. You can do 2 backslashes. I like to do 4. It really doesn't matter. And then you just type in the IP address of the machine that you want to try to connect to. So 192.168.57.134 for me, and then 2 more slashes like that. If you're running it with just 2 slashes, you don't have to put any there. So this is just character escaping because we're in Linux. So go ahead and hit enter. And you see that the server does not support extended security. Okay, don't worry about that. Anonymous login successful. Go ahead and hit enter on root password because we don't know it. And you can see that we did list out a file share. So let's go ahead and try to connect a different way. Let's tab up and let's delete this. -L. And we see that there's 2 file shares. There is an IPC $, and an admin $. The IPC is not really usually valuable to us, but the admin would be really valuable if we could connect to that. So let's go ahead and just paste that in here and see if we can get that connection. Okay, let's try this, hit enter, and you can see we have wrong password. So it's not going to let us connect to this share with anonymous access. So that's unfortunate. We could also try proof of concept to see if IPC works. Hit enter on that, and you can see now we're actually in this. And this is interesting. So we could say help to see the list of commands, and it's very similar to being inside of a Linux machine now. We can do something like ls to list the files, and we're actually access denied here. So this is what we call a dead end. We can't really access this. So we don't have any information extra gathered. We're going to come back to this time and time again with SMB client. This isn't the last time you're going to see it in the course, but I want you to know that it exists and the reason behind what we're doing here. And this is some of where the information is coming from in our scan. We're trying to connect out. We see the server name's Captrix. There's a comment that it's a Samba server, and we're going to try to come in here and connect to a file and maybe get lucky. But this time we didn't get lucky. So we're just going to go ahead and exit out. So that's all you need to know right now for SMB. SMB is an amazing protocol. When I see SMB, I get very happy, but we're going to focus on that very heavily when we get into the internal part, the Active Directory portion of this course, because that's when things get really juicy. Right now, we're just going to keep it simple, stupid on a lot of this stuff. It might feel really easy or very, very straightforward, depending, but I promise this is just going to keep building and building and building until we have a pretty big understanding on this, and there's going to be a lot of repetition and a lot of practice, and I think that's the best way to learn. So from here, I'm going to do a brief enumeration on SSH, how we can do enumeration with SSH, and then we're going to talk other items of enumeration and talk research. What are we doing? We've been collecting all this information and putting it into a text document, and you're probably like, so what? What can we do with it? And that's where things get exciting, and that's how we start to lead into exploitation. But we got to do a little bit more research first before we can get there. So that's it for this video. I'll catch you over in the next video when we are enumerating SSH. So now let's take a look at SSH. So from the original scan, we saw that it was open, and we saw open SSH 2.9 P2. So we're going to copy this and just make a note of that in our notes as well. I think that's important. So we'll just say SSH. We've got the version there. So let's take this and let's do a little bit of enumeration and talk through it. So sometimes you're going to get a scan back, and your scan's not going to have really a version here. It's just going to say SSH. And we can go and try to find that out ourselves, and it's always good to attempt that. What we're going to do is we're going to attempt to connect to SSH to this specific port and see if it gives us any information about what's running. And that's really it. At this point, that's most of the enumeration that we can do. Anything with SSH, the second that we attempt to make a login attempt is going to be exploitation. Even if we just try one password guess, that's exploitation. So we're not going to do that right now. We're going to save that for the exploitation part of the course. But I do want to show you a connection and just something funky with this anyway. So let's go ahead and just go to our terminal. And the typical way to SSH, if you've never done it before, is you just say SSH, and I want to SSH to a specific IP address. So this is the IP address I want to SSH to. The issue with this box is old. So when we go to try to SSH to it, it's going to say this, hey, we haven't found a matching key exchange. So they're giving us a few different offers here. We're going to have to type in a little bit of syntax. This is not common, but this is also useful to have in your notes because this does come up occasionally. So we can just say a -O, and we're going to type KEX like this, and then algorithms equals +. And I'll stall for just a second so you can catch up. And then I'm going to copy this one here, and then I'm going to paste it. And you're going to see we're going to get one more error. And this is going to ask about a cipher. So it says there's no cipher found. We're going to do a -C for cipher. We're just going to copy this, and we're going to paste it. And this should now provide the opportunity to connect. It says the authenticity can't be established. We've got an RSA fingerprint. Do you want to connect? We're going to type in yes. Okay. And what's happening here is it's asking us for a password. There's nothing here for us. So I'm going to hit Control-C. Why did we do this? Why do we even attempt to make this connection? Well, sometimes what happens is a banner is exposed, and the banner will say, hey, we're running SSH version XYZ, and this is built by this person, by this company, etc. So here we're looking for a banner. Unfortunately, there was no banner. So that doesn't give us a lot of information, but fortunately for us, when we had our scan here, we were able to pull down at least the OpenSSH 2.9 P2. So that's it. And I told you in the beginning, SSH isn't very exciting because there's not a lot of opportunities for like remote code execution. Really, the way we're going to have to do this is hammer it with brute force, and we'll talk about the reasonings why later. But we'll have to hammer it with brute force and just pray. Spray and pray, as we like to call it sometimes. But for now, that's it for SSH. So we're going to start moving into research, different tools we can use to research vulnerabilities, and additional videos on that. So I'll catch you over in the next video when we start digging into some of what we found. Let's talk now about identifying and researching potential vulnerabilities. So we have our notes here, and all I've done is move them off of Notepad and into Cherry Tree, because Cherry Tree is a bit more visual and bigger font for us on video. And I made two nodes. I made the main node here of notes, and then I made a child node here of vulnerabilities. So if we recall from our notes, we have 80 and 443, and we've identified some findings that we're going to write up on a pen test report. And those findings are, a default web page, 404 page was giving a little bit of information disclosure, and the server headers were disclosing some information as well. On top of that, we've identified some information that we need for research. Now we've got 80 here, and on port 80, we've got this Apache, this mod SSL, and this open SSL that we could research. And when we ran our NICTO scan, we identified something potentially juicy here, where mod SSL 2.8.4 falls in line with this, which is 2.8 and 7 or lower, which we are vulnerable to a remote buffer overflow, which may allow a remote shell. Remote buffer overflow, meaning that we don't have to be local, we can be remote, which we are, and we can gain access via remote shell, meaning we can gain access to that machine. So that's good, that's really good. The other one here we see is SMB, and we identified Samba version 2.2.1a. We also identified a Webalizer version 2.01, and we've identified OpenSSH 2.9 P2. So for this video, we're going to target the low-hanging fruit, and I put this in order of how I would attack it. Now, again, I always think 80, 443, and 139, 445 are the juiciest to me. This Webalizer might be juicy. OpenSSH, probably not that juicy. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and research 80 and 443, and then we'll research the SMB as well, and then I'll leave you to do a little digging on these just as practice, and we can see where we go. So from here, we're just going to go out and open up Firefox, and we'll go out to Google. And on Google, we can pick and choose which one we want to research here. Now, this mod SSL 2.8.4 is probably the juiciest of the items, and we might want to start there. So let's just say something like mod SSL 2.8.4. You see the 2.8.7 exploit showing up, by the way. We'll just do 2.8.4 exploit, and we'll see what comes up. Now, naughty words. We'll just call it open luck, okay? And you can see, don't cheat, Keyoptrix is coming up as well. But we're gonna go ahead and just open this Apache mod, and then we're gonna also open this GitHub one. And I'll cheat a little bit and tell you why here in a minute. So Apache mod SSL 2.8.7, less than 2.8.7. Scroll through here, and it just has the code for us. Now, this is where you have a chance to come through and read the code. Now, it looks like to me that they're just identifying, if you've never seen a buffer overflow, which you probably haven't, there will be one later in the course, it's identifying where it's going to have the architecture, right? So the architecture has its own identifier. So depending on, which it looks like this works for quite a bit of different architectures of Linux, depending on which Linux you're running is this return address here. So that's all this is doing. And then there's going to be code down here, I'm guessing, for an overflow, which you see a bunch of A's. As you're going to see later in the course, this is just overflows. So you'll learn to read this over time. Again, like, you do not have to code this. You do not have to be, you don't have to be super good developer, but just understanding kind of what's going on and making sure that the code that you download is safe on your computer and it's good to go. Now, this is coming off Exploit Database, so you can, I wouldn't say assume, but you can trust it for the most part that this is safe code. You have the option here to download the exploit, and you actually have the option to download the vulnerable app as well if you ever want to build out a machine and play on your own. So we have a little bit of information here that it just says, hey, this is less than 2.8.7, OpenSSL, and we've got a remote buffer overflow. There's nothing else here, but that's okay. That's, this might be good for us. This is something that we need to note. So we can copy this, and I would put it here, and we could just say something like 8443, potentially vulnerable to, we'll call it open luck, and then we'll just put it here. And we should also save this open luck, and I'll cheat a little bit and tell you guys why, is because this the exploit database one, without saying bad words, is not going to allow us to work. It's not going to work. The exploit's a little dated, and that's why there is a GitHub one out there that actually does work. So we're going to utilize the GitHub one instead when we do get to the exploitation section. So a little bit of a hint, a little bit of a foreshadowing, we are going to utilize this exploit. So we could also go in and research. We could say Apache HTTPD 1.3.20, copy that, and come to Google and just say, hey, I wonder if there's an exploit for that. And you would just search something like this. And you can see in here, Apache 1.3.20 is actually showing up in this vulnerability as well. So that's good. And then sometimes we see these websites like this CVE details. These are okay to look at. They're all right. Like, you come in here and what you want to look for is the score. Immediately my eyes shift to the score. I don't care about anything else. If I see something that's red, I get excited. But we see no red here. So I don't think that necessarily this is vulnerable to like a remote code execution. It's got a lot of denial of service, but I would want to see like a high score, which means a critical. That's what red is. Red is critical. So we've got high, moderate, and low here, but we don't have a critical one. So this doesn't look like it really probably has anything, but it is tied to this, which is another wheel spinning indicator here that, hey, you know what, we probably got an exploit here with this thing, or at least something that we should try. And that OpenSSL is tied directly to this mod SSL, so we don't really have to research it. Now let's move on to Samba here, Samba 2.2.1a. Let's copy this and let's check for an exploit. So just as simple as doing this and saying exploit. And we've got a few here. We've got this Samba 2.2.8 remote code execution. We've got Samba 2.2.x remote buffer overflow. And we've got one down here, which I love to see. This is Rapid7. So let's go to Rapid7 first. Why do I like to see Rapid7? Well, Rapid7 makes Metasploit. So it looks like this exploit is called Samba Trans2 Open. And let's read a little bit about the